Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to welcome a true leader and a strong friend of Israel. My friend, our friend, Israel's friend, Republican Whip, Senator John Cornyn of Texas.
Well, Roger, thank you very much. As you heard, Roger accompanied me on my first trip to Israel back in 2002. And since that time, he and his wife, Lyndon, have become dear friends to my wife, Sandy, and me. I want to thank Roger and Howard Corr, Marvin Foyer, and all my other friends here at AIPAC for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's a tremendous honor and privilege. I'm especially grateful to be asked to speak in light of Congress's current approval ratings. In all seriousness, I understand why many Americans look at Washington, D.C. these days and shake their heads. It often seems that every single issue here in Washington turns into a political football sooner or later. However, I want to assure you that the issue of U.S. support for Israel, we've been able to maintain an overwhelming bipartisan consensus. But that should come as no surprise. We know that the strong support for Israel on Capitol Hill reflects the strong support for Israel in our cities, towns, and communities across America. We know that Americans feel a special kinship with Israel because our countries share common values: liberty, equality, and human rights. America and Israel have stayed true to these values, even though we've had to respond to murderous attacks by some of the most ruthless terrorist organizations on the planet. I'll just mention one anecdote that stuck with me over the years. Back in February 2001, when the Second Intifada was raging and Palestinians were launching frequent terrorist bombings against Israeli civilians, the famously conservative Ariel Sharon was elected prime minister. Shortly before his government was sworn into office, Sharon addressed the Israeli parliament. And as one news story reported, he was interrupted several times by heckling from Arab legislators. Less than a year later, just 7 weeks after a Palestinian suicide bomber killed 30 Israelis at a Passover Seder, Prime Minister Sharon once again addressed the Israeli parliament. And once again, he was heckled by Arab legislators. I've always remembered that because I thought it told us something very significant about the nature of Israeli society. Despite the numerous wars that have been launched against it, despite living under the constant threat of terrorism, Israel remains a country where Arabs can serve in parliament and heckle the prime minister. Can anyone imagine Jewish legislators being allowed to heckle a Palestinian prime minister? Me neither. And that to me goes a long way to explain why Americans stand with Israel. A few moments ago, I mentioned the Second Intifada. My first trip to Israel actually took place at the height of the violence in 2002. Among other places that we visited, we traveled to the site of the Dolphinarium discotheque bombing in Tel Aviv, which killed 21 Israelis, almost all of them teenagers. I remember thinking, you know, my daughters could have been in that disco. And I'm sure Roger had the same thought, too, about his daughter. And it's something I will never forget. During our trip, I also had the chance to meet with Ariel Sharon and discuss a wide range of issues related to Israel and the broader Middle East. It was 3 years later that Prime Minister Sharon made a controversial decision, and perhaps the biggest concession in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. he unilaterally withdrew all Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip and also dismantled a number of Israeli settlements on the West Bank. In many ways, Israel's withdrawal from Gaza offered the Palestinians a test. They would be free to build political, civic, and cultural institutions without any interference from Israeli settlers or Israeli troops. The hope was that Palestinian reformers would seize the moment. Sadly, that's not what has happened. Instead, Gaza has become a terrorist haven run by Hamas, a place where short-range rockets and long-range Iranian missiles have been fired at Israeli civilians, a place where children are indoctrinated in a culture of death, a place where suspected collaborators are brutally murdered in the streets. I realize that some U.S. officials have in the past called for greater engagement with Hamas, but a terrorist group that promotes genocidal violence against Israelis and Americans is never going to be reformed by dialogue or concessions. Anyone still harboring illusions about Hamas should consult an August 2012 sermon delivered by one of its senior leaders, the Deputy Speaker of the Palestinian Legislative Council, who openly prayed for the murder of every single Jew and American on the planet. I don't know how anyone could listen to that sermon and still conclude that Israeli settlements are the biggest obstacle to Middle East peace. In reality, the biggest obstacle is the lack of a credible negotiating partner on the Palestinian side. After the 2012 Gaza war and the subsequent United Nations vote on Palestinian statehood, Hamas is more popular and more powerful than ever in the Palestinian territories. Meanwhile, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas continues to posture as a moderate. But is he really? We have to remember that President Abbas is the same man who once published a doctoral dissertation that denied the Holocaust. He's the same man who in September 2011 told the UN General Assembly that Israel had been occupying Palestinian land for 63 years. In other words, he believes that the 1948 founding of Israel represented an act of occupation. Is there any wonder why many Israelis simply don't trust him? By the way, according to a 2011 report, Abbas's doctoral dissertation is the basis for Holocaust studies in the Palestinian Authority. I find it repugnant that young Palestinians are being fed such poisonous lies in their school. And like you, I find it deeply disturbing that the world's #1 state sponsor of terrorism is so close to acquiring a nuclear weapon. In American politics, we sometimes talk about game-changing events. Well, if Iran goes nuclear, it could be the ultimate game ender for the Middle East. If you think about how dangerous the region is now, just wait until Iran triggers a nuclear arms race. Just wait until it blockades the Strait of Hormuz. Just wait until it annexes Iraq. Just wait until it becomes even more aggressive, if that's possible, in promoting global terrorism. In short, Stopping the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons is not optional. To paraphrase Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative. After all, even without nuclear weapons, the Iranian regime has orchestrated numerous assassinations on foreign soil, including our own. It's blown up embassies and community centers in Argentina. It has facilitated the murder of U.S. troops in Lebanon, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And it recently plotted to blow up a crowded restaurant right here in Washington, D.C. Henry Kissinger famously asked whether Iran was satisfied with being a country or determined to be a cause. I'm afraid the answer to that is now quite clear. Iran is not content to be a rational state actor. Instead, it seeks to destroy Israel, dominate the Middle East, and fuel anti-Western jihadism. Our only hope for a peaceful resolution of the Iranian nuclear crisis is to combine debilitating sanctions with the credible threat of military action. Of course, the key word in that sentence is credible. The mullahs will never abandon their nuclear efforts unless they genuinely believe that America is serious about keeping all options on the table. In order for the United States to maintain credibility with Iran, we must also maintain credibility with Israel. Just this last week, I helped introduce a Senate resolution that both reaffirms our commitment to defend Israel and reaffirms our commitment to prevent a nuclear Iran. As you know, virtually all of the United States aid to Israel is military aid. This aid is critically important to Israeli security, which is why I'm so disappointed that our delivery of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft keeps getting delayed. The F-35, as you know, are remarkably sophisticated aircraft that will dramatically enhance Israel's security. I've seen these aircraft up close and personal in Fort Worth, Texas, and I'm tremendously proud that my state is doing its part to fortify the U.S.-Israel relationship. Of course, you can't talk about Israeli security these days without mentioning Iron Dome, the country's world-class missile defense system. In the 2013 Defense Authorization Bill, which President Obama signed in early January, includes $211 million for funding of the Iron Dome system. As the Wall Street Journal noted during the recent Gaza war, Iron Dome has managed to make Tel Aviv and other cities impregnable to missile attacks. At the same time, Iron Dome is only one element of our bilateral security relationship, and we must continue to expand that relationship, especially given the volatility of the Middle East. As if Iran weren't a big enough problem, we are now witnessing a deadly civil war in Syria. Rather than go quietly for the good of his country, Bashar al-Assad has instead chosen to murder tens of thousands of his own people. Western efforts to arm and support the Syrian rebels have been complicated by uncertainty about their ultimate aims and also concerns about WMD. Al-Qaeda and other extremists have joined the fighting, and it would be truly calamitous if they got their hands on a massive stockpile of chemical weapons. Elsewhere in the Middle East, we see the Muslim Brotherhood leader attempting to create a new dictatorship in Egypt. We see rising sectarian violence in Iraq, and we see a substantial al-Qaeda presence in countries like Libya and Yemen. In the face of all of these security challenges, the U.S.-Israel alliance remains a symbol of democracy and resilience. It is an alliance, as I said, based on common values and a common determination to defend freedom against terrorists and dictators alike. Now more than ever, America needs a strong Israel, and Israel needs a strong America. Thank you very much.